I'm incredibly honored now to welcome for this afternoon's Fireside Chat the Honorable Kirstjen Nielsen, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, and General Frank McKenzie, Executive Director of the USF Global and National Security Institute and former Commander of U.S. Central Command. I previously listed the incredible accomplishments of General McKenzie this morning, but a bit more about Secretary Nielsen before we begin. Secretary Nielsen was sworn in as the sixth Secretary of the Homeland Security on December 6, 2017, serving in that position until April 2019. Before becoming Secretary, she served as both Chief of Staff to then Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly and White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Prior to entering the government service, she was the founder and president of the Synesis Consulting, a private consulting firm focused on preparedness strategies, policies, plans, tools, and tabletop exercises to prevent, protect against, and respond to catastrophic events with a focus on critical infrastructure interdependencies. Secretary Nielsen recently joined the board of directors for D-Wave Quantum, a leader in quantum computing systems, software, and service, and the world's first commercial supplier of quantum computers. Welcome, Secretary Nielsen and General McKenzie.
Thank you. I was just joking with General McKenzie to ask if I could make him stop saying nice things. So I thought we would start with a real-time demonstration of one of the more popular chatbots that many of us turn to, at least for amusement. So I asked ChatGPT a couple hours ago to tell me a national security joke about artificial intelligence. This is what I got. I'm going to read it exactly. Why did the AI get kicked out of the NSA? Because it kept leaking data, ... but only to other AIs. So right off the bat, we have a very interesting, what started off as a joke. I've got an AI telling me that it thinks what is funny is leaking data, sensitive data from the National Security Agency, but only to another AI. So off we go into the risk of what we're talking about with artificial intelligence. So Putin has said, whoever controls AI controls the world. So as we think about how we can integrate AI, what it means, we heard about some applications from the panel before. I wanted to turn it over to General McKenzie and ask, tell us what comes to mind for you of positive applications of AI within national security and perhaps homeland security as well.
Sure, so thanks Kirstjen. So many of you heard Brad Cooper earlier this morning talk about the remarkable things that he's been able to do in the Middle East with Task Force 59. When I think about what AI brings to national security, for me, I think first of all it's the ability to rapidly manipulate vast amounts of data that are otherwise inaccessible. Vast amounts of dissimilar data, older data, perhaps data that's stored structurally different than more recent data, the ability to see that. And not only data, but the ability to look at the environment and look at all kinds of things from sensory inputs in the environment. The ability to do that at machine speed is very important. And of course you can do that without using AI, but the next thing is the ability to correlate that to produce an understandable, actionable reference frame for, at least for the United States, for a human decision maker. I think that's a point Brad made this morning. I think we still see, and we can talk about it as we go through the discussion, human decision making still at the very center of this. But what you can do with AI is, again, you can process vast amounts of things that you could not formerly do in any kind of speed. You can do it in seconds now, even shorter than that in some cases, to present something that's relevant to a decision maker. Could be that you're looking at, Brad talked about 1,000 pictures. I would say there's a system that we used to use called Gorgon Stare. People in the room may be familiar with that. It's a vast system of tethered aerostats and balloons that look at just hundreds of thousands of square miles of terrain. Well, okay, now you've got hundreds of thousands of square mile of terrain data recorded. How do you actually use it in a manner that the word months and years isn't attached to? And you do it by applying AI measures to it. That's how you get to something. You tell it, we want to sort for, we want to look at vehicles, we want to look at vehicles moving. You can think of all the things you can do. But for me, what it does at the leading edge, at the tactical edge, is sort of compress that data down. And that applies to a combat situation. But I'll give you another example. Many of you may be familiar with something called the Venona files. So in really 1942 to 1945, the United States stored vast amounts of Soviet encrypted communications. Had no way to break them then, but over time and laboriously, we broke them. Now, we know, what we do now is we store vast amounts of encrypted communications that our adversaries use. We don't have the ability necessary to break it now, but we're going to break it in the future. Any way you can get after that data to break it faster makes it more relevant. The Venona files were very important, ultimately, in understanding more about Soviet intentions. And many of those files were not broken until 20 or 30 years later. If you could do that in 20 or 30 minutes, just think of the possibilities. But the amount of data that comes into an organization like the NSA is so vast. It's not possible to do it rapidly. But if you merge machine learning, if you merge AI, and you merge the ability that quantum computing gives you, you now have vast new avenues that are open to you. At the same time, we should remember that there are those who are doing it to us, perhaps more successfully than we are doing it to them. So, I see it primarily as still a human-centric business. There are places probably where we can talk that it's not going to be human-centric in the future, and we need to have an open discussion about that. But it really is the ability to allow human decision makers to distill patterns far more rapidly than they can now. There's a risk with that. If it's giving you something that's not intelligible, or that you can't sort in a rapid manner in a combat situation, that's certainly a clear risk. I think that's a risk worth taking as we go forward. So that's one of the things I'd start off with, Kirstjen.
I think that's really helpful. I think we heard from the panel earlier, one of the benefits of AI is this concept almost of tipping, right? It can look through all of the data, it can find the patterns, it can help us target not only our weapons and our surveillance capabilities, but it can help us target where to look for additional information, right? What else can we look at? So the flip side of that, of course, technology being neutral, it's never good nor evil. It's how we use it. So the flip side of that is, what would you say is the biggest threat to national security from the use of AI? And you alluded to our nation state opposite of allies. So what would you say?
Sure. I think that we get into a situation where we've lost the edge, where someone's able to create tactical problems for us with AI-fueled information, where we're too slow to respond. I think that's an external risk, a risk that we run if we don't stay current and continue to work in this field. And I think it's probably the most significant risk that we face. I think a second risk, though, less important, is we do have to solve how we go forward ethically with AI on the battlefield, because I think there's some profound ethical questions that confront us as we go forward. And as machine learning improves, as AI becomes increasingly able to self-correct, and in many combat situations, the period of decision-making is very, very small. You're going to become increasingly reliant on something that appears logical, appears lucid, because the human mind seeks consistency and lucidity in what is presented. And so I think the way we master that's going to be very important. And I think it's a risk with AI, frankly.
And we heard DepSec just before lunch talk about ethics and how the Department of Defense is very systematically and very specifically deploying LLMs and thinking through different projects from the perspective of, here are our ethics, here are our goals, here's the mission space. Let's make sure we constantly cabinet in. But I guess I would ask you, do you think that's possible? Do you think we're at a point where we can still put up policy guardrails with some of the systems, or has it already gotten away from us?
Great question. I think we're very close to that point if we haven't already crossed it in a couple of areas. And it's going to require constant attention to it in order to do that, constant oversight, because there's probably there are thousands of paths out there going forward in AI. And it's just inside the Department of Defense as an example. And so I think we just need to bear that in mind at all times as we examine what we have AI doing for us. Look, I'm just trying to find an example. Let's take one. Let's take this. An Aegis cruiser, which is a U.S. Navy warship, fires SM missiles at incoming missiles, incoming airplanes. Right now, what we call our shot doctrine, we tell it, the Aegis system will tell you, here's what we ought to be doing. We ought to look, we ought to shoot, we ought to look, we ought to shoot, or we ought to shoot, look, shoot, all kinds of combinations that you'll understand. So under certain battlefield conditions, you can go automated on that. You can turn a switch and the Aegis is going to run that system for you. There's a problem with that, though, in that some of these decisions are going to be made in tenths of a second, not 5 or 10 seconds. And we should, anytime we should remember the danger of that, we should go back and remember when we shot down the Iranian airplane in, I want to say, mid-'80s in the Strait of Hormuz. And that system was not automatic. That was human in the loop. It's a human error. But it's an example of what can happen when you get to battlefield systems that are now cycling so rapidly in order to stay alive, that we may say humans are in the loop, but humans are actually not in the loop. They made their decision to get out of the loop in order to be successful in combat. I think that's a clear risk.
And actually, that makes me think of cybersecurity, which is a field that you know quite well and are a established leader in. I think when we start talking about cyber and AI, obviously what comes to mind is it's faster. It could be automatic. In fact, you all have seen the data coming out of Cornell University. They have demonstrated or they have uncovered, I guess I should say, how an LLM can autonomously hack websites. They also have developed in a lab setting a worm that can travel between AI models. And then finally, we recently just heard from CrowdStrike that cybercriminals are using LLMs as we speak. So when we mix AI into cyber, other than social engineering, obviously faster malware, what comes to mind as a risk that you're watching for?
Sure. So, you mentioned at the beginning, quoting Vladimir Putin about who controls AI controls the world. I think that's actually not correct. I would say who controls cyber actually has the potential to control the world. I still see AI as a lot very relevant, but a subcomponent of cyber. So I think, when I think of this, I do believe that cyber, we have said it's one of the new domains of warfare. And let me just lay a foundation for just 1 second. We've always thought about air, land, sea, space, and cyber. Now, space and cyber are relatively new. Space has actually been around since the 1950s. Cyber is newer than that, but I would argue that we actually know and understand far more about space than we do cyber. And I say that because cyber, to me, is the limits of cyber or the limits of the human mind, and so it's unmappable in some ways. So that's why when we think about cyber as a domain in which there's going to be conflict in, I think it's actually just as demanding and perhaps more demanding than space, because we don't have clear policy standards that we apply throughout. And that's where, to come back to the question that you asked, I think that's where AI, particularly the ability of AI to teach itself, to learn, as you alluded to, is particularly dangerous for criminal activity and also for state-on-state activity, the ability to get inside systems. Although I will say, just in cybersecurity, the problem typically is never a machine. The problem is the human in the machine. And typically, most problems in cyber are attributable to the human making an error, perhaps because the machine told him to do that, but it's the human making an error, not necessarily the machine making an error. Now, that's probably increasingly going to change as we get a little more remote away from some of these processes, as some of the AI routines that we're talking about become more prevalent in not only in defense, but in all other aspects of cyber going forward.
I think there are a lot of ways we can compare cyber and AI, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we have representation in both fields of emerging technology. How do we adjust culturally? We heard a little bit about that this morning. How do we adjust from a regulatory, legislative perspective? We'll touch on that in a minute. But how do we understand what they are at its core? So in that realm, let's just tease into this a little bit more. So when you think about cyber, one of the potential threat vectors is the mass dissemination that cyber allows of information. We can use that in good and bad ways. Mix that with AI and deep fakes, and we have deep fakes, of course, of not just audio and video, and print as well. We have the case of the explosion outside the Pentagon, and we saw the market dip, only to realize, luckily quickly, that was actually a deep fake picture that was being sent around on social media. When you think about deep fakes, you think about AI, you think about cyber. How do we cabin that? How do we flag that? And maybe tease in a little bit of why we care. I mean, maybe we don't care as much if there's a picture of a famous actress that's been slightly changed. Maybe we do. But from a national security perspective, what could it mean?
So I think we need to care, and we need to care deeply about it. And so for most of my career as a uniformed officer, what mattered was the naked event. You planned for something, you achieved an objective, it happened, and then the effects of that instance, whether it was a successful operation, whatever it was, that was what actually you spun from there. Effects obtained from a kinetic or a non-kinetic event, but it was nonetheless an event that happened that was real and demonstrable. So now we're in a place where the naked event, particularly in the information space, is not necessarily relevant anymore. And in fact, you can manufacture it. I'll give you just an analog example, but it'll bleed over. So in fall of 2019, the Iranians shot down an RQ-4. Some of you may remember that. It was in June 2019. So we were trying to get a story out on this in the information space. The Iranian foreign minister was in Paris, and he, on the back of a napkin, drew a map that was completely wrong of where the airplane was, held it up, and that became the story. A couple months later, they seized a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Before we could even say the ship had been taken, two different entities of the Iranian government had released conflicting stories about what had happened. So if you don't care about what the truth is, and we know many of the entities we're talking about don't, and you just want to inject it very rapidly, then it's both of those interjections set the tone for everything that follows. So you can see the applicability for in domestic news and international news, the ability to wholesale create an event, and what now AI gives you the ability to do with deep fakes is make it look very, very real, particularly if you're getting your news off this thing, and and it's a 15 or 20 second little bite of information. Then that's enough to be that can be very effective. So I think we should be very, very concerned about it. Because we're losing the information war in Ukraine right now. I would argue that and certainly in the region I was in, we're not fighting at an advantage, because we're ultimately, as we approach it, the United States approaches it, we want to have an essential relationship with the truth. If you're not bound by an essential relationship with the truth, then you can do anything. And both at governmental level and at criminal level. And sometimes they're the same.
The truth is an interesting concept when it comes to AI. We've all heard about the hallucinations. To me, one of the biggest threats and risks that we have from AI is culturally a misunderstanding of what it does and what it does not do. So we tend to think that because something is human-like and responding to us in the interface and can discuss back and forth, we tend to confuse a couple things, that something that uses a thinking process is thinking, which is not true, at least as of today. But secondarily, we assume that the AI and the model will tell us the truth. In fact, that's also not what it does, right? It's mathematical, it's probabilistic, it tells us a story. And we've seen some instances where through what people now generically call hallucinations, which is sort of any time the LLM doesn't work, I feel like somebody's calling it a hallucination, but we'll use the broadest term here. You've seen where a lawyer went to brief a case and used an LLM to try to hurry up his homework, so to speak. And the LLM came up with a bunch of cases that seemed very on point, so he stuck them in the brief, he turned the brief in, and the cases were completely made up, never existed. Because the LLM, from a pattern perspective, was like, okay, based on the question he asked, you want me to help you get this result. What it would require are cases like this. Now, I'm not presuming that I understand what the LLM was thinking, but mathematically, that's how the process went based on the inquiry. So inquiries become important. Culturally, it becomes important to understand the difference between a machine using thinking processes and thinking, telling a story and telling the truth. In national security, how do we protect against that? How do we raise awareness at the field levels so that those using these tools understand their inherent limitations?
Sure. So I think you carefully scope it. For example, AI can be enormously helpful in logistics. all kinds of structured things in logistics, predictions and analysis of flow of material, stuff like that. Very helpful there. I think the closer you get to conflict, it can still be very, very useful, but the more dangerous the tool becomes. Because now it's actually processing an environment in which there are vectors that are actively trying to feed it bad information, feed the sensors bad information, if you will. There's a living will on the other side, and it may not be AI on the other side. So I think that as you get closer to combat applications, to pure military applications, I think you need to scope and scale it very, very carefully to what you want it to do, and you need to have a good understanding of it. And I think you need to constantly test it and test your own views of it, especially if it's going to have some kind of self-programming capability and ability to learn lessons. What are the lessons that it's learning, and how is it going to apply those lessons going forward? It's interesting in ChatGPT. It's lethal in combat, perhaps, for combat systems to have that capability.
So let's talk about that. So with lethal autonomous weapon systems, where do you come down on it? You talk a lot about the human. It's important to keep the human in the loop. Right. People try to differentiate and say human on the loop and then human out of the loop. But let's talk about laws. How do you think about that moving forward?
I start from, I think the U.S. perspective should be, you need to apply these tools ethically, which means there's got to be human judgment involved, particularly if you're going to kill someone. I think there has to be a human that's involved in that decision. Otherwise, I think we give up all our values. I think that's essential to our values is that there's going to be a moral judgment made about what you're going to do. And that, unfortunately, and that can take time and seconds in this world or hours, days in another world. So that's a problem that we have not yet resolved. Now, I think a smart person smarter than me could say, well, the AI can adopt those values and make those decisions. I personally am not yet willing to make that jump, that synaptic leap. I admit it's possible. It's probably worth talking about, but I'm just not sure that I can get there right now with it. But again, to come back to some of the things I've talked about, in order to be effective, you've got to be fast. And the things I'm talking about doing inherently slow the pace of your response down, and that's a big trade-off at the tactical level.
So we talked about hallucinations. We talked about some of the other threats and risks. Obviously, there are well-known risks with bias. We talk about threats to AI, threats from AI, threats to AI. There's all kinds, right? We talk about the data injection. We talk about data poisoning. How do we, this is more of maybe a traditional technological question, but how do we protect against the threats to the actual AI model itself? It's more of a cyber attack vector, but how do we protect against that?
Constant sampling. First of all, take precautions at the beginning. Know and understand your firewall or what your firewall equivalents are. Know how data can be injected. Unfortunately, data can be injected in such a variety of ways, sophisticated ways now. I think that's very difficult. It's increasingly difficult to do. But I think you continually sample the environment, sample the quality of the answers that you're getting, and I think it's probably, at least from my perspective, and I don't claim to be a deep expert on it, that would be, if I were doing it, that's how I would approach it.
So what about regulation? I wanted to swing back to that. So we see all sorts of attempts. We have standard boards coming out. We've got the NIST framework. Of course, we have the White House executive order that was mentioned earlier today. We have different activities within our international groups. OECD put out some principles. We have then things developing under other relationships like AUKUS Pillar 2. How do you think, let's take international first, how can we work with our allies if we're concerned about a proliferation aspect of either AI weapons or just AI becoming to that place where we can't pull it back?
Yeah, so I think there are good international protocols out there right now that talk about how you share weapons technology, and I think we should possibly learn some lessons from those. One thing that we're very, the United States is very big on weapon systems is what we call end user certification. What are you going to do with it? What's the effect it's going to have? And we're pretty stringent. This is not cyber necessarily, but I just say it conceptually. This is something you can apply to that, and you might get like-minded nations to buy on to it. And I think that's. Yeah, I'm struggling to find a really good answer because I think it is such a wild west out there right now. But I would start with something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way perhaps to think about the domestic context as well. We heard this morning There might be difficulty or I shouldn't say difficulty, there are downsides to prohibiting development, prohibiting research. So you take it down the chain, if you will, and you start to think about, well, is there a way to prohibit specific use cases or perhaps users? And by users, an obvious example that comes to mind is children. We've seen how children interacting with AI has already not gone well with some of the social media that they have access to. But from a regulatory perspective, what advice would you give to policymakers to ensure that they don't stifle innovation, but that they're able to do it in a scalable, flexible way to keep up with the pace of the fact that this is changing by the minute?
So first of all, do no harm and recognize that it's a global issue. So be careful what you legislate in the United States, because the net has no boundaries and it's going to be reachable everywhere. So that's a factor to consider. And perhaps actually the most important factor to consider, I think, as you go forward. Recognize that it's going to be very difficult to do anything inside a single country on this issue because of the globalization of the technology. The net's infinite. And so it's hard, and we actually do see some nations trying to fence off parts of the net in the same way, and with varying degrees of success. But I would be very cautious about proceeding with something like this as a matter of domestic policy. But having said that, I recognize the need to protect children. I recognize the danger that can occur with that. That's the one question I probably don't know that I have a good answer on, to be honest with you.
I think it's a very complex problem. When we, as a security minister, one of the top priorities in my portfolio was everything related to cyber. We had just finally successfully created CISA within the Department of Homeland Security, which gave DHS additional authorities to, among other things, help to protect critical infrastructure. But we always found, working with international allies, there's always this rub. If you just prohibit, who's actually going to follow that prohibition, right? The good guys. The bad guys are not going to follow that prohibition. So how do you voluntarily come to the table? How do you restrict in such a way that you still enable innovation and that you're able to move forward from there? So with that perspective...
I'm sorry, let me jump. One thing came to mind as you were talking. The one thing that I think is very important is education, actually. I think that's an area that in cyber in general, but AI in particular, is vital. And by education, I'm talking K-12. I'm talking about fundamental education for young people about this as we go forward. And one of the things we do at Cyber Florida is we've had an opportunity to look at the state education system and what it does there. And there's a little bit in there, but not a lot that's mandated. There are a lot of things that are mandated in the Florida Core program for K through 12. Cyber and AI are not one of those things. Of course, I'm married to an educator. She would say, well, what are you going to take out if you're going to put something in, another unfunded mandate or another unconsidered mandate? But I would argue that education is actually vitally important, particularly since I think the structure of this environment changes maybe every 6 months, maybe every year. So Kirstjen and I were talking before we came on stage about the value of a computer science degree. First of all, it's a great degree. But a year after you're out, you're going to be outdated. And we know how we solve that problem is through certificate programs that a lot of universities offer, which are not necessarily an academic degree granting program, but a 3-month course in something, a 6-week course in something, or a 6-month course in some aspect of cyber or AI that actually keeps you current, because it is exploding. And that's why I say cyber is actually far more challenging than space right now.
And I think that, we were talking just before, I think that education can also be soft education and formal education in the sense of raising awareness of the citizenry, right? Even if it's only about things like deep fakes or how to interact. I mean, the other danger I see with any of the chatbots is that because it seems human, we see instance after instance of people sort of unloading all of their sensitive personal information in reply to the reply from their prompt. And quickly that's gobbled up, and then that can be used for other reasons probably than the person intended. So I think education is key for all of us to keep in mind. This goes back to a different version of cyber hygiene, right? What does AI hygiene look like? How can we think through what that is required? I wanted to turn, I'll go back to a couple other questions, but wanted to turn to some from the audience. One is from a commander's perspective. What role does AI play in decision making? You touched on that at the top of the hour, but give us some additional details.
So when I was at CENTCOM, we were just really beginning to grapple with AI. But I would tell you, as a combatant commander, what you want it to do is you want it to do things that process, again, the data intake for an organization like Central Command is staggering. Some of you are from CENTCOM that are in the room that know what I mean. So what you want to do is rapidly find a way to make that comprehensible. And that's where I think this comes in. I don't need help making decisions. I'm confident I can make those decisions. But what I want to know and understand is, what does the environment look like, particularly when it's a cloudy environment, a difficult environment to understand. AI, I think, can help there and should help there. The other thing that AI can do, and we were just beginning this work on the Joint Staff when I left it and came to CENTCOM, and it's out there. But when you look at how you deploy move units, and I'll go up a level to the Joint Staff. If I were the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman, I would want the ability to rapidly simulate the most efficient way to send 3 submarines to CENTCOM or send 2 submarines to Indo-PACOM. What's the cost? What's the cost immediately? What's the cost long term? And we can do that. We did it manually for years and come up with pretty good solutions, but it takes time to do that. Now we do it with what I'd call manual computer. We've got a simulation that'll run it, but there may be AI in it. I think they're beginning to introduce it. But what you want is something that you say, look, here are the parameters. Give me some ideas. And it kicks back out a number of ideas. Looking downstream 12, 15 years, what's this decision going to mean to Navy maintenance, as an example, which we always worry about. So if I were looking for help, that's where I would want the help. I would not seek it in what I would call qualitative decision making, because I think that at the level I was at is still the province of humans. And I don't see that changing. But quantitative decision making, and once an old boss of mine, a great guy named Jim Mattis, said, look, here's what you want to do with any problem. You want to get as much of it quantitatively solved as you can. So if the problem is 100, if you can get 80% of it solved quantitatively with good quantitative data, then really that'll drive the remaining 20% that you got to solve subjectively or qualitatively. And that's where I think AI can help at the level I'm talking about. Now, it has different applications at the tactical level, but at the higher level, that's where I think AI plays.
And I think data is an interesting part of this, right? I mean, my mom used to say, with respect to TV, but it applies here, garbage in, garbage out. And I think the data that we're feeding these systems becomes very important. So how do you think about that? How do we ensure that we have quality data? How do we clean data to prevent bias and some of the other threats we already talked about? How do we, for that matter, ensure that our data sets are not used by the adversary?
Yeah. So first of all, you got to constantly sample the data. You got to constantly look at it. You got to have a variety of protocols in place that'll let you take a look at data as it is increasingly combined. Does it still make sense? Is it going some goofy way that we can't see? So that's one thing, and that requires humans to take a look at it. Eventually, I would say people will argue that you can have AI do AI there, and that might be where you want to go. I don't think we're at that particular point yet. And in terms of protecting it, from an adversary, he certainly is going to try to inject bad data into your system. I know that because that's what we do. So I would assume that they're trying to do that all the time. But again, it comes back to, you got to sample it. You got to look at it. You got to have protocols in place that tell you, here's what we're seeing. And if something looks strange, you might have machine learning that'll be able to tell you that, but it might require a human being to tell you that too. And so you probably want to I would err on the side of caution, even if that slows you down a little bit. But that's the best way to protect your data as it comes in. Rigorous, continual self-assessments of the information, sampling of the information, constant testing the information. And some of that can actually be automated and should be automated. You're not going to have human beings do that all the time. But the other one is recognize that your data is always under attack. It's under attack when it comes in. It's under attack when you store it. It's under attack when you present it. The Japanese in World War II were confident their codes weren't broken. Well, we are confident in many cases that our systems are secure, and we may be challenged on that in ways that we don't even understand now.
So another specific example question from the audience. How can we use AI to increase early warning and targeting, specifically as it relates to missile defense? And is AI able to make this more effective in the future?
Sure. So let me begin by saying some of you may have seen some articles in the New York Times that talks about the way the Israelis are using AI for targeting in Gaza. It's worth reading those articles. They're not complimentary articles about it, but it's worth reading. And they are using AI, I believe, to assist in targeting, because when you target something, you've got to build, if you're looking at a building, you've got to build a pattern of life around the building. You've got to understand the history of the building. You've got to keep, preferably you soak it, what we would call soak it for a while, to look at it, to develop what's going on there. You can actually automate all those things. But at some point, it's got to come to a human decision. But the articles about Israel use of AI and their offensive targeting is worthwhile. But to get back to the actual question, so I think of all the fields that are out there, ballistic missile defense probably is one of that's ripest for the use of AI. Because again, what you're talking about here is bringing in vast amounts of data, some of it conflicting, and you've got to process it in very, very short timelines. I was once a deputy director of operations in the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, and doing the nuclear thing. And you'd work an 8-hour shift, and every shift you'd have a scenario where the United States would be attacked, and you're making decisions in 12 to 15 minutes there. You know, we're going to move the president. Is he going to ride it out? What are we going to do? This, that. So things that would allow you to think more rapidly there would be helpful. Although I would tell you, ultimately, none of those decisions are ever going to be automated. They're all going to be human. But what you can do is maybe what we would call get to attack characterization earlier. What is the nature of this attack? Is it real? Is it not? Is it a mistake? And there's ways to shift the data, sort the data a lot more effectively than we were doing it when I was doing this, which is 15 years ago. And we're still essentially doing the same thing now. And the reasons we do that, because you don't want to ever be answerable to a black box for nuclear command and control. You want people to be involved in that. Interestingly, the Russians have taken a different approach on that. They are much more bought into an electronic approach. I'll just leave it there. And but we think our approach is actually better. But I think just in terms of, go back to what I said about the Aegis system, a cruiser steaming out there with a radar operational, the ability to rapidly produce trajectories, ability to rapidly do all those things. We're probably approaching the limits of machines now to do that. But if you want to try to find a way to knit it together and propose courses of action, there's probably something there for AI to work. I'm guessing the Navy's probably experimenting with that now. Although, again, I think with that system, we're probably about as close as we can get to what you can do with it in terms of man-machine interface. Look, that's a great question. It's a fascinating question. I've thought about it a lot. I think there's a lot of ripe ground there for AI to work.
So I think if I can try to soundbite you, and part of what you've been saying during our conversation is that you see AI as a force multiplier, but not as a force remover. In other words, we'll still need the human in the loop. We'll still need people making decisions. We are not looking, from your perspective, at a strategic path forward where machines run everything from a military perspective. So it's more of a, and I think we've also seen they can be very helpful in simulations along the same lines, gaming. You know, the reason the tabletop exercises with senior officials always break down is because inevitably somebody asks a question that's not in the exercise brief, and then you sort of have to break, and someone has to go figure it out. So when you're doing exercises, I mean, it's something that AI can be very helpful with. Another question from the audience that's near and dear to my heart, it's asking about, you know, the combination of quantum and AI. So specifically it's saying, when considering the impacts of AI in the cyber domain and its uses in the physical domains, is anyone talking about the pairing of AI and quantum level compute and processing?
Why don't you start with that?
I would say yes. There, you know, and in full disclosure, I do sit on the board of a quantum company, but there are partnerships already out there, because if you conceptually think about the compute power from quantum and how it enables you to analyze an optimization problem very differently than without said capability, and then you add to it the probabilistic nature and capability set that comes with AI, you suddenly can apply it to different things, such as, you know, identifying previously unidentified molecules. Because now you can do it faster. You can go through all of the different possibilities for where that particle could exist and the characteristics of that particle. but in a way that you would not necessarily be able to do if the two technologies were separate. So I myself think that's a very exciting area. I also, with my risk management hat on, would immediately say it poses new and novel risks, of course, like all of these do, which goes back to risk management. So ultimately, is this just a risk management problem? Is this really more about understanding the different threats and risks that we've talked about and others are talking about, and figuring out how we can manage in our companies, in our governments, in our environments, as opposed to thinking about stopping AI development or stopping particular use cases for that matter?
Just to jump on the quantum computing thing for a moment.
Please.
So one of the particularly defense-specific things that has quantum application is code breaking and code generation. The National Security Agency does that, and what quantum has given us the ability to do is really leap forward dramatically in ability to break codes, but also it's worrisome in the ability to protect our own codes going forward. It's simple. It's simply a question of speed and volume, the ability to sort through vast amounts of data rapidly that we're already sort of talking about. You pair that with AI and you get a really exponential leap going forward. One other thing I would just like to say about AI and its application is, the Air Force is tinkering with, airplanes flying with unmanned wingmen going forward. In fact, I think you're going to see that. I think the next fighter the Air Force makes after the F-35 is going to be designed to fly with an unmanned wingman. The B-21, as you know, is designed to be operated with or without a crew. So, and the beauty of B-21 without a crew is you don't have to worry about them, and you don't have to pack all that stuff inside to keep them alive. So the problem, though, is this, and I would just like to jump on this for a moment. Everything assumes, everything in the discussion up to this point has assumed that we're going to have good communications, that we're going to have access to the cloud, that things are going to move rapidly. And I would argue that that is a fundamentally flawed assumption, in combat in particular, but even in the United States, as we've seen from some examples here just recently. Look, electromagnetic pulse technology and the use of EMPs, either EMP-directed weapons or more likely the use of nuclear weapons in low Earth orbit, have the ability to really take us back to the Stone Age. And none of this stuff's going to work. And unless you're very well protected, and none of the stuff's very well protected because it's extremely costly to protect it. You've got to be able to put it inside a cage that'll keep electromagnetic pulse out. Strangely enough, in the 1980s, we did this routinely. We expected to fight the Russians in a nuclear war, so we were prepared to live in a nuclear environment. We're not prepared to live in a nuclear environment today. And I don't mean one where it's going to blow up Tampa. I'm talking about a warhead that explodes 120 miles over our head. There's no prompt radiation effects. Nobody gets hurt. None of the cars on this campus are ever going to drive again. None of the computers are ever going to work again. And so when we think about the effects in the future, I just think that's an important effect that we don't tend to think about. But you know who thinks about it a lot? The Russians. They think about it a lot. And they've never stopped thinking about it. We did stop thinking about it. They have not stopped thinking about it. The Chinese think about it. The North Koreans think about it. Because it's distasteful to us, but that's going to have a huge effect. So as you think about AI applications going forward, increasingly you're going to have to think about AI applications that are going to be able to operate independently. And there we get into the dangerous field of autonomous battlefield combat systems. Where we assume there's going to be some connection back to the mothership of some kind. Otherwise you're going to have to put a very large system into that piece of equipment. Although that's going to go down over time pretty rapidly, I expect. But it's just something to think about as we look ahead. I think that's a significant problem that we just routinely underestimate from a systemic perspective.
I think it also raises a great point, which is just a question of resilience, and maybe we'll end on that. Okay, thank you. Resilience, which is when we think about this, what is the redundancy, right? When we're protecting critical infrastructure, we often advise for them to think about the provision of essential functions unplugged. How could they go back 40 years and still deliver whatever the essential function is, electricity, for example? Presuming that there would be some sort of cyber attack that would take out their digital way or their SCADA systems to do it. With AI, It's a very good point, because what is the redundancy? As soon as we become reliant on it, that aggregated use becomes a risk in and of itself because we become dependent on it. And I also just wanted to dovetail quickly on your code breaking comment, which is actually the dovetail of technology. So as technologies emerge, I think a core part of risk management is really not only thinking about horizon risk, but how the different techs come together and can perhaps have new risk vectors, for example, quantum being something that may or may not be able to break all of the blockchain. And then what does that mean? Independently, obviously created in some senses, but they come together and now they have effects. So from that risk management perspective, what can people do at companies? What can people do for their families? How is this different than any other risk management kind of problem? Or is it just the same in terms of identify the threat, quantify the consequences, figure out what it is that you want to protect the most, make sure that you have the ability to do that? Or is AI so different that it requires other controls?
I think the model is still a valid model, but I think it's very hard to particularize with AI, and I think frankly, at least for me, we're still sorting through that. I think what you need to have the ability to do is operate without AI. I mean, that's what I would, if I were, I wouldn't want to have a backup that didn't involve AI, just in case, for whatever reason, either the data's bad, a variety of circumstances, but you want to have the ability to operate without it. The problem is, as we have found in the U.S. government, that's extremely expensive to do, extremely resource intensive, and it requires you actually to do training that's not related to how you actually want to fight or run your company in order to do that, in order to have that kind of backup. And that's why universally people take that risk, I would argue.
Yeah.
Because it's on the scale, it's catastrophic if it happens. We'll choose to believe it's unlikely. And maybe it is.
So we have one and a half more quick, because they're related, to turn to, but quickly I feel that we have to cover the People's Republic of China. So I don't know that we can quickly cover it though, but from a threat perspective, you see General Nakasone talking a lot about, when it comes to AI, one of his big concerns is the fact that we know how much data China steals, right? And so to the extent that there is a race, and people can debate whether that's what we're in, he's concerned that China will just take the best and the brightest of what we are developing in the United States and then use it for their purposes. And in fact, Director Wray recently said that he believes that the amount of data that has been stolen from the United States from every country in the world combined is still less than the amount of data that China has stolen from the United States. So how do we think about China when it comes to AI? We know they're using it for surveillance. Deputy Secretary Hicks talked about how we are using it very differently than they are using it. But how do we think about that threat?
Well, first is education. I mean, I think people need to know and understand. You're right. China has, what they've taken from us. I mean, a lot. You look at Chinese airplanes, look at Chinese ships. They didn't draw those up off the back of an envelope. They looked at things that were successful and built on it. So I think you got to educate people about it, and I think you've got to produce regulations and laws that are friendly to business, that make it financially reasonable for U.S. business and industry to avoid being sucked into the Chinese trap. But I speak as a military guy, and I realize that there are vast economic consequences for that, and I'll just observe that.
Yeah. Luckily, we're doing national security right now. So the two questions that I'm just going to add, and we'll end here. Will AI democratize the battlefield, allow non-state actors to have larger effects? And the second question, which we'll combine, is around ethics, and will that negatively impact systems' ability to sort of function and learn? On the former, I would just say it's definitely one of my biggest concerns, because I think what AI does, if you think about what we call the cyber poverty line, if you equate what an AI poverty line would look like, I think what AI does is it makes it that much more expensive for us to manage risk, and it makes it a lot less expensive for those to attack us in all of the ways that we've talked about from a cyber perspective. So will AI democratize the battlefield, and do ethics hinder us in any way from developing new systems?
So the battlefield is becoming democratized right now. We see it in Central Command. We've seen it certainly while I was in command. The United States has always assumed would have total air supremacy everywhere since really the end of the Second World War and a couple of short times during the Korean War. We no longer have that. Our bases in Central Command are routinely overflown by drones that we are unable often to shoot down. So that's, and those are flown not necessarily by nation states, but by proxy elements. So the battlefield is democratized. In Ukraine, you see small drones that can knock out a tank. And why is AI a factor there? Because here's the thing, you launch a drone, a small drone, it's a one-way drone, it's going to fly out, and it's got some kind of system in it that tells it to look for something like a tank. And if you see a tank, dive on it. And that's actually a simple form of AI in some respects. It's completely independent. Once it's launched, it's not coming back. If it can't see that, then you tell it just fly into the ground and blow itself up. That's democratization of the battlefield, and that's clearly out there right now. It's going to become increasingly prevalent as we go forward. Now, there are ways to beat that. You can push back against that, and so there's always a constant struggle between offense and defense. But in general, I accept the idea that the battlefield is becoming democratized. By that I mean people have access to smaller, more capable, more lethal systems that were once reserved for states, rich states, but now anybody can have it, and AI plays an important role in that by making it possible to do that. So the second question is, look, we're going to approach this from a perspective of ethics, and that we want to ensure that the combat systems that we deploy are consistent with the ethics of our country. Not everybody labors under that problem, but the United States does. So I would say whatever it costs, and whatever it costs in terms of resources or in terms of time and development, it's worth spending, because when it's all said and done, it needs to be a United States product that occurs, and that means it's going to be an ethical product.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. We can talk about this for hours. We could. I just want to thank GNSI. You know, these conferences are really a fantastic opportunity for us all to not only talk to each other, but to really share ideas, which particularly when it comes to national security and emerging technology is the only way to do it, that people-to-people understanding, raising awareness, educating, as the General has said. So thank you all for being here. And with that, we're going to turn it over, but thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.